Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking to you about some literary elements and techniques. These are not all the literary elements or techniques by any standard, but this should give you a good overview, and I'm hoping to cover the most commonly used literary elements and techniques and what I think are the most helpful to get started really analyzing literature. So I'm going to share my screen with you to do that. And I would just like to show you guys my PowerPoint explaining all of this. There are some video links on here, which I'll be posting on Google Classroom. So if you need to at any point to watch the other video links that helpfully explain things, please just pause this video and then come back to it. So first we're going to talk about literary elements. Literary elements are essential. They're needed for all works of literature. So you really have to have these things. There may be a few really different exceptions, but for the most part, you really need to have all of these to create a cohesive work of literature. I remember this because, as you could see, I have my little E in elements underlined and my little E in essential underlined. So elements, you have to have them. You really do need them. So they are plot, characterization, setting, narration or point of view or narrator, conflict, theme, tone, and mood. Most other literary devices or terms are going to be literary techniques, which I'll talk about in just a bit. So the first one is plot. These are the events that happen in a story. So these are the things that happen. So with plot, there's sort of a subsection here. So a plot diagram is your basic structure for most works of literature. So most books, short stories, follow this format. So there's an exposition, there's the rising action, the climax, the falling action, the resolution, and the denouement. So we'll talk about each of those. The exposition is the part of a work that introduces the character, setting, and situation. It's also called the introduction, and it sometimes sets the tone. I say sometimes because every once in a while you have an exposition that's much darker or lighter than the rest of the story, and that can change over the course of a work. Sometimes the exposition also gives you a hint of what's coming, so it can vary in tone, but usually it sets the tone for what you're reading. You get to know the characters, you get to know what's happening in the story. You may get a little bit of a hint of conflict as well. The rising action is the part of the plot or events that leads up to the high point or the climax of the story. So if you were to look at this plot diagram here, your exposition is where you start off. Your rising action is this slope here. So this is where things really build up. So you're leading up to the climax. The climax is the high point of interest or suspense in a literary work. Your main character usually deals directly with the problem by the climax. So if you have a character who's struggling with an issue, let's say that a character is struggling to do a certain class project or assignment, the climax would be when the character is actually dealing with that thing. So if they're doing a class presentation and they're working up to that throughout the whole story, the climax is when they would actually give the presentation. The falling action takes place after the climax, but before the resolution of a literary work. And it's called the falling action because, again, if you look here, you're sort of coming down from the climax. So you have a really high point of excitement and interest, and then there are things that happen afterwards that lead you to the resolution. Resolution is the part of a plot when the problem is resolved. So if you look within the word resolved, there's that word solved. That's how I remember what the resolution is. Everything sort of wraps up. The resolution can be positive or negative. Sometimes the story may have an open ending also. So resolution doesn't always mean that you get an answer to everything that happens in the story, but it does tie up some things. It does resolve the problem. The story usually ends soon after the resolution. Sometimes people complain that if a story drags on too long, that too many things happen after the main conflict is resolved, the main problem in the story. And then after the resolution, you have something called the denouement. This is anything that happens after the resolution of the plot. The central conflict is resolved and the consequences are decided. So essentially, the denouement is merely a tying up of loose ends. And denouement is actually French for the tying up. So if you look back at the plot diagram, I put denouement in parentheses on here. That's because not every story has a denouement. It doesn't always wrap up neatly after the main conflict is resolved. If you think of certain movies, I always mention Legally Blonde because I think that's a good example, but sometimes after the main problem is resolved within the story, at the end credits, they'll say what happens to the characters. This happens a lot if you're talking about a true story, something that happened in real life. You'll see what happened to the characters years later. In Legally Blonde, you get like a flash forward after that main conflict is resolved. So that's your denouement. And that is our plot diagram. One other thing that I want to mention before I forget, if you look at this plot diagram, some people draw this a little bit differently. Sometimes this rising action and falling action slope are the same length. I don't like to do that because usually in most stories, your rising action takes a lot longer than your falling action. After the climax, we tend to want things to wrap up a bit more quickly. So this is a shorter slope because there's usually less events in the falling action. The other thing that does, if we look at this drawing, your exposition, you usually begin the story at a certain point, and then by your resolution, you usually end in a different emotional place. There's usually things that have happened and things that have changed permanently. So I like to use this diagram because it shows those different levels. And that's our plot diagram. Next, we're going to talk about characterization, creating and revealing the traits of a character. Readers learn about characters through what the author writes about that character, descriptions by other characters, actions, dialogue, and thoughts. So there's a lot of different components to how we learn about characters. Think about the way we learn about different people. Sometimes we learn about them through their appearance, maybe how they carry themselves, how they talk, what they talk about. Sometimes we learn about people by what others say about them, by their actions, and in stories, we learn about them by their thoughts. So we know if a character is thinking something that is going to contribute to how we view them, how we see that character. The setting is the time and place of a literary work. Setting could also be how long a story takes place. So you have some short stories that take place in the span of an hour. You have other books that take place over 20 years. So think about the length of time, the time, and the place where a literary work happens. Oftentimes we may learn things about the time period, about the place in the world. These things can really impact the story, and most stories have settings. The point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. We'll discuss specific points of view in just a little bit. So conflict is a struggle between two forces. So this is basically your problem within the story. You have a few types of conflicts. So internal conflicts are within the main character. This is called man versus self. So that's with that character struggling with something themselves. So let's say that I don't know if I should go to my friend's party or if I should stay home and volunteer to do something instead of going to that friend's party. I'm going to weigh the pros and the cons, and I'm going to think about this myself. An external conflict is something that happens outside of the main character. If you want a trick to remember these words, think internal has the prefix in, so this is something inside the character, and external has ext, so something outside of that character. Think like an exit sign. So there's a few varieties of this. We have man versus nature, or as my students point out, woman versus nature, or character versus nature, whatever you'd like to call it. So man versus nature is some sort of a conflict with the natural environment, the natural elements. This could be someone is stuck in a hurricane. Survival stories are often man versus nature. Man versus man is when two characters have a problem, have a conflict between each other. Man versus machine, this is usually man versus technology. This can be something as large scale as there's a revolution and robots are trying to take over the world, or this could be something small scale. I always use the example, if I have a problem with my smartboard in my classroom, that's still a man versus machine conflict, even though it's much smaller scale. Man versus society. So a character has a problem with the world they live in. This is another one that could vary depending on scale. So you could have a large scale man versus society problem. Your character is trying to fight the government or the whole society and community. Books like The Giver or The Hunger Games have man versus society conflicts. This could also be, though, something a lot smaller. Think about like Mean Girls. You have a clique of girls and you have one character who may or may not fall into that smaller society's views. So this could be something like maybe someone goes against a school culture or a work environment issue. That can be man versus society too. So these are all the different kinds of problems you could have within a story. Theme, the central idea, concept, message, or purpose in a literary work. So sometimes my students run into the problem where they want to say their theme is one word. So they'll say that the theme is love or friendship or happiness or bitterness. Those things aren't truly themes. They're usually ideas and they can help us generate a theme, but they're not full themes within themselves. You want to think about what the story says about that one word idea. You could have a story that's about love, but you may have one story that is putting forth the theme that love causes you to make foolish decisions, or you may have another story that says love inspires us to do great things. So those full statements are themes. The one-word ideas help us get to a theme, but are not themes themselves. The tone is the writer or speaker's attitude and feelings towards the subject. They could be positive, or the tone could be positive or negative, sincere or sarcastic, formal or informal, personal or pompous. Those are all examples of what a tone can be, but those are not the only examples of what a tone can be. Tone is really important when you're reading something, because if you misunderstand the author's tone, you could misinterpret their theme. So think about, especially works that are sarcastic, you want to watch out for the tone of the author, because if you don't catch that sarcasm, you may think that they're writing to advocate the opposite of what they're truly putting forward. Mood is sort of the flip side of tone. These are the feelings that the reader experiences created by the author's words. It can be suggested by diction, events, or setting. Mood is also sometimes called atmosphere. Sometimes your tone and your mood are the same thing. So sometimes your author is writing an ominous story and you have an ominous, foreboding, apprehensive, sort of scared feeling when you're reading that story. Other times you may have tones and moods that are very different. So you could have an author that's writing very carelessly about a really deep subject, and your mood about a reader, as a reader, may be really unsettled by that. So just know that sometimes they're the same, but sometimes they're very different. Okay, so all of those things were literary elements. So those are things that most stories really need to have. They're essential. Literary techniques are optional. Now, there are many more literary techniques than what I'm going to go over just now, but these are some of the most common ones, and I think the most helpful for analyzing literature. But just know, if you're thinking, oh, where is this literary element or technique? It may just be that I didn't cover them because it may be a less common literary technique. Okay, so the first one that I like to talk about is imagery, a word or phrase that appeals to one or more of the senses. We usually think about visual imagery, which is sight imagery, but there are actually many more kinds of imagery. So you could have imagery that appeals to sound, smell, taste, or touch, and there are even some more beyond that I'm not going to cover. So this little slide here, this picture, helps illustrate different kinds of imagery. So sight imagery, the tiny red ant climbed up the broken twig. We can clearly visualize a small little ant. Smell, the sweet smell of freshly baked apple filled the air. We can smell that, so that appeals to our nose. Taste, one bite of the sour lemon caused my lips to pucker. Sound, the car squeaked every time I hit a bump in the road. And touch, the sharp edge of the paper cut my finger and made it sting. So all of those are different types of imagery, but they still appeal to our senses. An allusion is a reference to a person, place, event, or artistic or literary work. It suggests a whole set of ideas in a concise, short and to the point manner. So sometimes we make a reference to something and then instantly you think about all the other things associated with that reference. So I put a little Mean Girls gif here, because sometimes when we say on Wednesdays we wear pink, we think of a whole set of associations with that word. I used to use this when I taught O. Henry's Gift of the Magi. So that title is an allusion to something, and when we read that title, we think of maybe the whole biblical event that follows it. Some people say that allusions have to be something that's common. They don't always have to be a reference that everyone's going to get or know right away. Sometimes uncovering what the reference is to is part of that author's strategy. Figurative language. So this is it's a more umbrella term, so it's more of a general category than some of the other ideas we've discussed. So this is speech not meant to be interpreted literally. It's related closely to figures of speech such as hyperbole, oxymoron, paradox, and simile. So this is anything that you can't imagine or can't actually happen. So we hear the front door open and shut a whole story. That's from Jodi Picoult's My Sister's Keeper. So if your door opens and shut, that doesn't actually tell you a whole story, but it's suggesting something. So it's suggesting that this sort of scene or this moment is done, or that this action suggests a whole lot more than just opening and shutting a door. And know that hyperbole, oxymoron, paradox, and simile are all types of figurative language. So you could think about it like figurative language is an umbrella that covers all these other different types of speech that is not meant literally, does not actually happen. A flashback is a moment that interrupts a sequence of events to tell an event from an earlier time, to illuminate the past, to illuminate the present, or develop a character's motivation. So in the movie Titanic, it's told largely through a flashback. You have this main character, Rose, who tells you her story of being on the Titanic. Anytime really you have someone who is thinking back to when they were younger, you are going through a flashback. It could also be something that the author does. So you may be reading and going through a certain sequence of events, and then the author flashes back to an earlier time so you can understand what a character is doing, why they're doing it, and better understand certain situations. Hyperbole is the type of figurative language, an exaggeration or overstatement. So something that you're maybe blowing out of proportion. World War III begins immediately, not with an assassinated archduke or a crazy dictator, but with a missed left turn. That's another one from My Sister's Keeper. So World War III is not actually happening because the characters missed a turn in their car, but it causes a dramatic fight. So hyperbole is stressing the drama of this conflict. An oxymoron is a figure of speech that combines two opposite ideas. So things like jumbo shrimp, how can you have a small seafood item, creature that's actually large? And deafening silence, so something that contradicts itself. Same difference, all of these are examples of oxymoron, so two opposite ideas combined, and it's usually on the word level, so these are words that are placed right next to each other and they're opposites. Like oxymorons, paradoxes also have to do with opposite ideas. So this is a statement that seems to be contradictory, opposite, but is actually true. So a paradox is a little bit more large scale than an oxymoron, and it doesn't always have to do with a word level issue. So these are things like your enemy's friend is your enemy. So if you have someone that you don't get along with and they have a friend, that person is also going to get into a conflict with you in a lot of cases. George Bernard Shaw said, "What a pity that youth must be wasted on the young." That's a paradox. Sometimes when we're young, we don't appreciate all the things that we can do, whereas an older person may appreciate that more. There's another one from My Sister's Keeper. We pass a truck, Batch Elder Casket Company. It reads on the side, drive safely. Isn't that a conflict of interest? So this character is thinking about how there is a casket company, and if they're telling you to drive safely, doesn't it really hurt their mission because they are providing caskets for people who have passed away. Personification. One of the really good tips for this word is that you have the word person right in the definition or right in the word itself, so that helps you with the definition. A non-human subject is given human characteristics or traits. The wind whispered through the leaves. So the wind is not actually whispering and telling you something, but that sound gives it a human quality. And this description is making it seem like a human creature. A simile is a comparison of two things using the words like or as. She doesn't speak, just lifts her hand to her head and threads her fingers through her hair. It comes out in a thick clump, drifts down the carpet like a small blizzard. That's another one from My Sister's Keeper. So comparing this girl's hair coming out to a small blizzard, and it's got the word like. This is from Langston Hughes's Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? So we have another simile. We're using the word like and comparing a dream that was deferred or pushed off to a raisin that shrivels up in the sun. A metaphor is similar to a simile. It's a comparison, but it does not use the words like or as. Unlike the other girls in school with their smooth waterfalls of yellow hair caught up in a headband like ribbon candy, hers was an absolute tornado of black curls. Again, that's from My Sister's Keeper. Here we have smooth waterfalls of yellow hair. Their hair is not actually a literal waterfall, but it's being compared to one. And same thing with the tornado of black curls. Again, her hair is not actually a tornado. That would be pretty dramatic and bad, but it's just being compared to one because apparently it's untamed. All right, your protagonist. So that is your main character. Most stories do have a protagonist, but not every work of literature does. So I put it under the literary techniques. So Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, SpongeBob, all of these are main characters. Your antagonist is the character or force in conflict with the main character. So some classic antagonists on this slide. Antagonists don't always have to be evil characters. If I am at a staff meeting and there's a tray of cookies and my assistant and I both want the last cookie on that tray, even though neither of us is evil, we're in conflict with each other because we both have the same goal, or me achieving my goal would prevent her from achieving that same goal. So antagonists don't always have to be evil. In some stories, of course, though, they are. A symbol is anything that stands for or represents something else, usually something concrete representing something abstract. So something concrete is something that you can pick up and hold. And something abstract is a little bit harder to get your hands on. So if you think about love, that's a very hard thing to picture. There's really nothing physical that can embody that idea. But if we think of a heart, that sort of gets us to understand, okay, we're talking about feelings, we're talking about emotions. So taking something abstract and giving it an embodiment, something that you can picture, understand, better get your hands on. So a symbol can be conventional or traditional. So things like the flag, the cross, Star of David, all of those things are classic. A lot of people know what they mean or what they represent. You could also have a symbol that's really personal, exclusive to the work. So maybe in a certain work of literature, you have a wind-up doll, and that's a really important feature for that work of literature. You may have a lot of your own symbols. So I think about sometimes like a piece of jewelry or something that was passed down to me from one of my family members. Those things hold deep symbolic meaning for me, but someone else looking at that object may not know what it means to me personally. Irony. So irony is difficult to explain, but really does help when you have some examples. So this is a surprising, interesting, or amusing contradiction. It reverses your expectation. So here I have a fire hydrant that is on fire. This is an example of irony because you'd expect a fire hydrant to put out fire, but here it is on fire and is not being very helpful. This picture is a dog, and there's a chewed up certificate of obedience for dog training. So this is ironic because you'd expect the dog who went through and mastered obedience school to be well behaved, but he's chewed up that certificate. So there are a few different kinds of irony. It plays with your expectations. Is another way to understand this. So I posted a little link here. If you want to go ahead and pause the video, my video, and watch that, that should help you understand as well. And another little picture here. Nothing is written in stone, which is written in stone. Very ironic, so you'd expect that not to be a permanent saying, but it is. Okay. Story of an Hour is a short story, which is heavily ironic. All right, there's a few different kinds of irony. So the first is verbal irony, then we have situational irony, and then we have dramatic irony. Verbal irony are words suggesting the opposite of their meaning. So you say something, but it's not what you actually mean. You're suggesting the opposite. It's a really helpful video here. Again, if you want to pause and watch that, there's a fantastic explanation. Situational irony, when there is an incongruity or difference between what is expected to happen and what actually occurs. So you think something is going to happen, but usually the opposite happens. So classic example in Monsters, Inc., you would expect the child to be afraid of the monster, but it's actually the opposite. The monsters are very afraid of this small child. So that's what creates an ironic situation, situational irony. And dramatic irony, when the full meaning of a character's words or actions or events which happen to a character are clearly understood by the reader or audience, but not by the character themselves. So, readers know something that the character does not. Let's say that you're watching a TV show and you know that there is a hole in the floor and your character doesn't, and you're watching them and they're about to fall into that hole. You are in suspense. Your character has no idea that that's going to happen. Posting another video here. I just want to point out something really great that this mentions, that with dramatic irony, you can use it for a few different purposes. So sometimes dramatic irony is used to create really funny situations that make us laugh. And then in other cases, it's used to create something really suspenseful because we know that something maybe awful or really sad is going to happen to a character and they don't know it themselves. I just want to point out also that on the previous slide about situational irony, there's another link. So if you want to pause me and watch those, that would be very helpful. All right, and those are our key literary elements and techniques. Like I said, those aren't all of them, but hopefully that has helped you to understand some of the most essential elements and some of the most important and most common literary techniques. Thanks for watching.